Well, it's really affected um, just everything. The biggest thing is to my ability to make a living, because live performance was really all that was left for musicians to make money doing. Um, you can make a little bit of money streaming, but it's not a living. Um, so yeah, really just it really stopped me from being a musician professionally. Um, what do you think will
I
change?
think everybody has their different ways of coping with stressful situations. And some people have responded to this stressful situation by sort of freezing up. Um, Others have taken to, blaming, trying to find people to blame, and becoming kind of aggressive. Um, Others perhaps, have felt a need to be cared for, especially. And I think others have become very restless and, uh, you know, um, perfectionistic. And that was already, I think, Deerhoof's natural psychic state. And so the pandemic has just taken that and kind of cranked it up. So, even though it looks like, oh wow, we're doing really well in the pandemic, we've been very productive. Look at all the stuff we put out this year, blah blah blah. I think it's fair to understand that that's our way of coping with stress, and it doesn't necessarily, our version of coping isn't superior to anyone else's. Um, so we've turned a lot to recording since we can't tour, and actually since touring in the future is even somewhat in doubt, at least in this country, because touring doesn't just depend on the health of the population. It also depends on the existence of venues to play in. And, one by one, they're going out of business. At least the size venues that we tend to play, and which tend to be, mom and pop clubs, small to medium sized clubs, and they're just closing. So there might not be much left with which to construct, a national tour. I think in other countries, they're, the the government is more, what gets called socialist. Um, Almost any government is a little bit more socialist than ours, and they've seen it as more important to pay those clubs and those venues to stay closed, but also stay in business. So tax money went to them. So we may be able to more easily tour in Europe. We may be able to tour in Asia, Australia, um, than in the US, but we'll just have to see. But for now, it's made us get really focused on recording. And in our band, everybody has little miniature home recording setups, and so everybody's been busy making demos and simulating. We live in 4 different cities, so we simulate playing together by by recording, overdubbing on top of each other's recordings.
I don't know yet. There's a lot of clubs that have already closed. Um, but it possibly will mean that a lot of people who've been cooped up for maybe years will be really hungry to see live music. So there could just be a big demand for it.
Well, I guess I would have thought that what could have changed would have been most likely to change not when it was over, but when it started, or once it was a couple months in and it kind of dawned on, reality set in on everyone, and they realized, like, this isn't going away for a long time, and people have very little incentive to maintain public health. They are not being paid to stay home, or they're being paid almost nothing, joke level. One stimulus check. They're being told that they must continue to go to work in many cases, but then being told that after work they must immediately go home, and they're not allowed to leave the house, and it just creates a division between those people who have decided to make personal sacrifices for the sake of the greater community's health, and those people who feel like they're going nuts in quarantine and want to break the mask mandate, break the stay-at-home orders, and continue to gather, even if it means prolonging the pandemic, which is exactly what's happening. So I would have thought what would have changed is that, it would have become clear that the government needs to give back some of that tax money that we pay to the taxpayer and pay them to stay home, basically draft them into the army of staying home, the army of public health. And I was surprised when that really didn't happen. And I would have thought that once we realized as a society that we were doing okay without certain businesses thriving, that we have always been taught are necessary for our society to function, I would have thought that, like, well, wait a second, the pollution's going down when everybody's at home, and we seem to be doing fine without certain kinds of businesses. Maybe we just don't need them anymore. But that hasn't happened either. Very quickly the pressure was put back on society to resume business as usual as much as possible. And so what do I actually think will change afterwards? I can say the things that I would like to change, but and I know from your Twitter account that you and I agree on many of those points, but you and I are two people and without much power, and so it needs to be a lot of people with a public outcry, a massive public outcry, before the handful of people who do have wealth and power will be forced to make adjustments to their operations. If that outcry is not powerful enough, then I expect very little to change. We're on many roads to many different disasters at the same time, and if the public outcry isn't powerful enough, then we will simply continue down those paths to disaster. Under one president, maybe we're running down the path, and another president we're, sort of like lightly jogging, but it's still the path to disaster.
I'm not sure. I am really not focusing on anything related to the future in any way, because I'm just deciding to kind of surrender to this moment. And, if I never tour again, that's fine. If I tour again, that's fine. But I'm just taking this time to really connect to myself and make a new life and a new way to make a living slowly. But touring really just is not on my mind at all in any way. And yeah, just really trying to let go of the need to get back to a life that doesn't really exist anymore. And just live in the present moment, because that is the safest place that you can be in.
Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind is playing, being together, reunited with my bandmates and friends. The same people, they're my friends, my bandmates are my friends. And to do a thing that we taught ourselves to do, over a couple decades. And there's a certain kind of zone that you can get into when you're playing, or a certain kind of high that's achieved in performance, and especially playing for other people, that is in my life is unique and can't be achieved any other way. And a funny feeling takes over when we're on tour. At least for me, I feel like, wait, this is what I was born to do. This is what I was meant to do. I have a purpose. And to be able to perform again would, I'm looking forward to, if performance does come back, I'm looking forward to once again feeling like I'm doing what I was meant to do. And sharing that experience with my bandmates, sharing that experience with audiences, whether they're friends or strangers, and they're usually a combination of both. I also miss just kind of the, there's the part of touring that's under control and somewhat repetitive, but there's an exciting part of it that, it was only after a couple months of being locked down that I started to realize that part of what I was missing was the sort of random element, and the way, you could just get into unexpected conversations on unexpected topics with total strangers, at the merch table, or with the staff at sound check, or whatever. It's just meeting new people. I'm kind of a shy person, but tour has long been my way of meeting people, and so without tour, I'm a bit of a hermit, you know. I think, to go back to the previous question, what do you think will change after this is over? Another thing that I just thought of that I thought might change is something about the way the music industry is structured right now, which is that streaming is king, and you know that that it would dawn on everyone that, wait a second, if musicians can no longer earn a living from their recordings because streaming has redirected all of the money that people used to pay to labels and artists to now streaming, or to nothing. Maybe they just don't pay anything for music. But the money that might have gone to the artist is now going to Spotify in the form of ad revenue. So Spotify's business model is to sell listeners to advertisers. And so the people who end up with the money is, the corporate elite of Spotify or YouTube or whatever other streaming, Apple Music. And I would have thought that it might have dawned on people like, well, wait a second, the people who make the music, like, if the only way that remained for them to make any money after everything else had been diverted to a few rich people was touring, and now touring isn't possible, then those musicians whose music we are listening to a lot and whose music helps us survive and keep our spirits up day after day, are now going to be starving, so and might not be able to keep making music. But I was surprised that although, for instance, obviously Bandcamp started doing their once a month, taking no cut from sales, music sales on their site, and that has been huge for musicians and just for music culture in general. I think people knew about that, but there's been nothing on the broader scale in terms of change. There's just basically been that kind of charity on the part of Bandcamp, one website, but there's not been a larger reckoning with the whole structure of how music is done. And so one thing that I still hope will change is that that Spotify will be forced to stop underpaying artists, without whom they don't have anything. They don't have any listeners to sell to the advertisers. If there's no music, there's no listeners. So I would love to see, a massive movement, whether it takes the form of government regulation or a massive boycott or something that pressures the streaming services to compensate musicians enough that they will be able to pay their rent and not starve. And I think that's everything. Thanks for the questions.